Marcus Chun had been silent for exactly 47 days when the Zephyrians invaded Earth. Not by choice, but because of what the doctors called selective mutism following trauma. The irony wasn't lost on him that his inability to speak would become humanity's greatest weapon. The invasion began on a Tuesday morning in March. Marcus was sitting in his therapist's waiting room, reading a magazine about gardening, when the first ships appeared over major cities worldwide. They were beautiful in a terrifying way, crystalline structures that seemed to bend light around them, casting rainbow shadows on the ground below. Dr. Sarah Martinez had been trying to help Marcus speak again for months. The incident that stole his voice had been classified, buried under layers of government secrecy. Even Marcus wasn't entirely sure what had happened in that underground facility in Nevada. He remembered flashing lights, a sound that seemed to come from inside his skull, and waking up 3 days later unable to say a single word. "Marcus, are you seeing this?" Dr. Martinez burst through her office door, tablet in hand. The usually composed woman looked frantic. "They're everywhere. Ships over every major city. The military isn't responding. Nothing's working." Marcus looked up from his magazine and nodded. Through the window, he could see people in the street pointing at the sky. Some were taking pictures with their phones. Others were running. A few just stood there, mouths open, staring upward at the impossible sight. The ships hung in the air like frozen waterfalls, utterly silent. No engines, no visible propulsion, just massive crystalline forms defying gravity with casual indifference. Marcus felt something stir in the back of his mind, a familiar tingling sensation he'd experienced once before in that Nevada facility. Within hours, the aliens made contact. They didn't use radio or television broadcasts. Instead, every person on Earth simply heard a voice in their head simultaneously. The voice was female, melodious, and carried an undertone of amusement that made Marcus's skin crawl. "Greetings, humans. I am Queen Zura THYSS of the Zephyrian Empire. Your planet has been selected for integration into our collective. You will surrender your governments, your militaries, and your independence. In return, you will be allowed to serve as productive members of our society. Resistance is futile and will result in immediate termination." The voice paused, and Marcus could almost hear the smile in it when it continued. "We have observed your species for some time. You are loud, chaotic, and primitive, but you have certain qualities that make you useful. Your creativity, your adaptability, your stubborn refusal to accept defeat. These traits will serve our empire well." Around the world, governments tried to respond. Military forces mobilized. World leaders attempted to negotiate. But every form of electronic communication had been disabled. Radios were silent. Internet connections were severed. Even simple devices like walkie-talkies produced nothing but static. Marcus watched the chaos unfold from Dr. Martinez's office. She had given up trying to leave and was glued to her tablet, which somehow still displayed news feed from before the communication blackout. The last reports showed military jets approaching the alien ships, only to fall from the sky when they got within a certain range. Not shot down, simply powered down as if their engines had forgotten how to work. "How are they doing this?" Dr. Martinez whispered, more to herself than to Marcus. "It's like they've turned off every piece of technology on the planet." Marcus pulled out a notebook, something he'd carried since losing his voice, and wrote, "Not everything. Your tablet still works. Some things are unaffected." Dr. Martinez looked at the tablet in her hands with new eyes. "You're right. This one's still working, but my phone isn't. Why would some devices work and others not?" Before Marcus could write a response, the voice of Queen Zura THYSS filled their minds again. This time, there was genuine amusement in her tone. "We see that some of you are trying to understand our technology. How quaint. Your primitive minds cannot comprehend the sophistication of psychic dampening fields. We control all electromagnetic communication through pure mental force. Your thoughts, your machines, your very neurons, all can be influenced by those with sufficient psychic ability." The alien queen's mental voice grew stronger, more commanding. To demonstrate our power, we will now conduct a simple test. Every human on your planet will speak aloud the words, "I submit to the Zephyrian Empire," 3 times. You will find that you have no choice in this matter. Marcus felt the alien presence pushing into his mind like ice water. Around him, Dr. Martinez opened her mouth and began to speak in a monotone voice. "I submit to the Zephyrian Empire. I submit to the Zephyrian Empire. I submit to the Zephyrian Empire." The pressure in Marcus's head intensified. The alien queen's will pressed against his consciousness, demanding compliance. He could feel her confusion when he remained silent. The force doubled, then tripled. It felt like someone was driving spikes through his skull. But Marcus said nothing. He couldn't have spoken even if he wanted to. The same neurological condition that had stolen his voice was somehow protecting him from the alien queen's mental control. The damage to his speech centers, whatever had happened in that Nevada facility, had created an unexpected shield against psychic manipulation. Through the window, Marcus could see people in the street, all speaking the same words in unison. Their faces were blank, their voices mechanical. Even children were compelled to speak the alien queen's words. The pressure in his head suddenly ceased. For a moment, there was complete silence in his mind. Then, Queen Zarathustra spoke again, and this time her voice was directed specifically at him. "Interesting. One human refuses to comply. Guards, scan for the source of resistance." Marcus felt something probing his mind. Not the brutal force from before, but a careful, surgical examination. The presence was cold and alien, completely different from any human thought or emotion. It was like having someone rifle through his memories while he watched helplessly. "Fascinating," the queen's voice mused. "This one appears to be broken. His neural pathways for speech production have been severely damaged. But there is something else here. Something familiar." The probing intensified. Marcus gritted his teeth and tried to think of anything except what had happened in Nevada. But it was useless. The alien presence was too strong, too skilled. "Ah," Queen Zarathustra said, and now her voice carried a note of recognition. "Now I understand. You have been exposed to psychic energy before, haven't you, little human? Your mind bears the scars of contact with forces beyond your comprehension." Images flashed through Marcus's consciousness, memories that weren't entirely his own. He saw the underground facility in Nevada, the strange artifact they had uncovered, the moment when something ancient and powerful had awakened. He felt again the overwhelming presence that had reached across space and time to touch his mind. "The predecessors," the alien queen whispered, and for the first time, her voice contained something other than amusement. There was respect there, and perhaps a hint of fear. "You have been touched by the predecessors. That explains your resistance." Dr. Martinez had finished speaking the compelled words, and was now staring at Marcus with wide, frightened eyes. She could hear the queen's voice too, but she didn't understand what was happening. "Marcus," she whispered, "why didn't you speak? How did you resist?" Marcus pulled out his notebook, but before he could write anything, Queen Zarathustra spoke again. "Guards, bring this one to me. I wish to examine him more closely. He may prove useful in ways I had not anticipated." The crystalline ship over their city began to descend. Marcus watched through the window as a beam of light erupted from its base, scanning the building. When it found him, the light intensified, and he felt a strange tingling sensation wash over his body. "Transport commencing," an emotionless voice announced in his head. Dr. Martinez lunged toward him. "Marcus, no." But it was too late. The world dissolved into light and energy. Marcus felt his body breaking apart at the molecular level, his consciousness floating in a sea of alien technology. For a moment that felt like eternity, he existed as pure information, transmitted through space by forces he couldn't begin to understand. Then, he was solid again, standing in a vast chamber that defied human comprehension. The walls were made of the same crystalline material as the ships, but they seemed to pulse with internal light. Geometric patterns flowed across their surfaces like living things constantly shifting and rearranging themselves. Queen Zarathustra stood, or perhaps floated, at the center of the chamber. She was tall and impossibly graceful, with skin that seemed to be made of polished silver. Her eyes were pools of swirling energy, ancient and knowing. When she moved, reality seemed to bend slightly around her, as if space itself was eager to accommodate her presence. "Welcome to my ship, little human," she said aloud, her voice carrying the same musical quality it had possessed in his mind. "You're the first of your species to resist my psychic commands. I am curious to learn how this is possible." Marcus stood silently, meeting her gaze. He had faced alien contact before in that Nevada facility. This was different, more controlled, more purposeful, but the underlying feeling was the same. He was in the presence of something vast and incomprehensible. The Queen gestured, and Marcus felt invisible bonds holding him in place. Not physical restraints, but something that acted directly on his nervous system. He could breathe and move his eyes, but everything else was frozen. "Do not be afraid," Queen Zarathustra said, approaching him with fluid steps. "I mean you no immediate harm. Your resistance intrigues me. In all my centuries of conquest, I have never encountered a mind that could completely reject my influence." She reached out with one long-fingered hand and touched his forehead. Marcus felt her presence flooding into his mind again, but this time it was different. Instead of trying to control him, she was reading him like a book. "Yes," she murmured, her eyes widening slightly. "The predecessors have indeed marked you. Their technology flows through your neural pathways like a river of starfire. No wonder you can resist me." The Queen withdrew her hand and stepped back, studying him with new interest. "Tell me, human, do you know what the predecessors were?" Marcus remained silent, not because he chose to, but because he couldn't speak. The Queen seemed to interpret his silence as defiance. She laughed, a sound like crystal bells ringing in harmony. "Such stoic determination. You face an enemy capable of destroying your entire species, and yet you refuse to show fear or offer information. How wonderfully human." The Queen began to pace around him, her movements hypnotic and unsettling. The predecessors were an ancient race that ruled this galaxy millions of years before your species learned to make fire. They possessed psychic abilities so advanced that they could reshape reality with their thoughts. They built vast cities that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions beyond your comprehension. She paused directly in front of him. They also created certain safeguards, technologies, and weapons designed to protect against psychic domination. It appears that you, my silent friend, have been exposed to one of these safeguards. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The artifact in Nevada, had it been predecessor technology? Is that what had damaged his mind and stolen his voice? The predecessors vanished long ago. Queen Zarathustra continued. Some say they ascended to a higher plane of existence. Others believe they were destroyed by their own power. But they left behind traces of their presence. Artifacts, ruins, genetic modifications in certain species. The Queen's smile was sharp and predatory. Your species appears to have been influenced by predecessor intervention at some point in your evolutionary history. Most humans possess latent psychic potential that remains dormant throughout their lives. But you, dear Marcus, yes, I know your name now, you have been awakened. She gestured again, and the invisible bonds holding Marcus relaxed slightly. He could move his arms and hands, though his feet remained rooted in place. "I'm going to offer you a choice," the Queen said. "Your planet's conquest is inevitable. My empire spans 1,000 worlds, and each one fell to the same psychic domination you just witnessed. But you represent something unique, a human who cannot be controlled through conventional psychic means." The Queen's eyes gleamed with ancient hunger. "Join me willingly, and I will spare your world the harshest aspects of integration. Refuse, and I will extract what I need from your mind through more direct methods. Marcus looked around the crystalline chamber, taking in the alien technology and the impossible architecture. He thought of Earth, of Dr. Martinez, of the millions of people who had been forced to speak the Queen's words. He thought of the Nevada facility and the price he had paid for humanity's first contact with forces beyond their understanding. Then he pulled out his notebook and wrote a single word, "No." Queen's RTHYSS read the word and laughed again, but this time there was less amusement in the sound. "How delightfully predictable," she said. "Very well, human. We shall do this the difficult way." She raised her hand, and Marcus felt psychic energy gathering around them like a storm. The crystalline walls began to pulse faster, and geometric patterns raced across their surfaces with increasing speed. "I will break down the barriers in your mind one by one," the Queen promised. "I will examine every memory, every thought, every secret your species possesses. And when I am finished, you will tell me everything I wish to know about predecessor technology." The psychic assault began in earnest. It was like being struck by lightning made of pure thought. Marcus felt the Queen's presence hammering against the damaged portions of his mind, trying to force a way through the neurological barriers that protected him. But the barriers held. Whatever had happened to him in Nevada, whatever price he had paid for his silence, it had created a defense that even an alien queen with centuries of experience couldn't easily breach. The assault intensified. Marcus fell to his knees as waves of psychic energy crashed over him. He could feel the Queen's frustration growing as she encountered resistance at every turn. "Impossible," she hissed. "The predecessor modifications in your mind are more extensive than I realized. They have created a perfect shield against psychic intrusion." The attack ceased abruptly. Marcus remained on his knees, breathing heavily, as Queen Zarathustra stared down at him with a mixture of respect and annoyance. "You are proving more resilient than anticipated," she admitted. "Perhaps a different approach is required." The Queen gestured, and the walls of the chamber became transparent. Marcus could see space beyond them, the curved edge of Earth, blue and beautiful and impossibly fragile. But he could also see other ships, hundreds of them, positioned around the planet like a net of crystal and light. "Observe," Queen ZRTHYSS commanded. One of the smaller ships fired a beam of energy toward Earth's surface. Marcus watched in horror as a section of what looked like a major city simply vanished. Not destroyed, but converted into nothingness. "That was your city of Mumbai," the Queen said conversationally. 12 million people, gone in an instant. "Would you like to see me erase another? Perhaps London? Or New York?" Marcus stared at the space where Mumbai had been, feeling something cold and terrible settling in his chest. 12 million people. Gone. Because he had said no. "I can continue this demonstration indefinitely," the Queen said. "Your resistance is admirable, but it comes at a cost. How many of your people are you willing to sacrifice for your silence?" Marcus looked up at her, and for the first time since losing his voice, he desperately wanted to speak. Not to give her information, but to scream his rage and helplessness at the universe. Instead, he picked up his notebook and wrote, "What do you want to know?" Queen's RTHYSS smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Marcus had ever seen. "Everything," she said simply. "I want to know everything." The questioning began immediately. Queen's RTHYSS created what she called a memory resonance chamber, a smaller crystalline room where she could attempt to extract information from Marcus without the risk of damaging the predecessor modifications in his mind. The process was delicate, she explained, like performing surgery with a hammer. Marcus sat in the center of the chamber, surrounded by floating crystals that hummed with psychic energy. Each one was attuned to a different aspect of human consciousness: memory, emotion, sensory experience, abstract thought. The Queen could use them to probe specific areas of his mind while avoiding the damaged speech centers that protected him. "Tell me about the Nevada facility," she commanded, her voice echoing from multiple directions at once. Marcus wrote in his notebook, Underground Research Base. Classified project. I was a linguist consultant. A linguist. The Queen's interest sharpened. What language were you meant to translate? Unknown symbols. Geometric patterns. Found with an artifact. The floating crystals pulsed brighter, and Marcus felt them brushing against his memories of that day. He couldn't prevent the Queen from seeing what had happened, but the barriers in his mind filtered the information, showing her only surface details. He remembered arriving at the facility 3 months before the invasion. Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins, the project director, had been desperate. They had discovered something buried beneath the Nevada desert, something that predated human civilization by millions of years. The artifact was a perfect sphere, 2 meters in diameter, made of a material that absorbed all forms of scanning. The sphere had markings, Marcus wrote, symbols that changed when observed. They needed someone who specialized in xenolinguistics. Xenolinguistics, the Queen repeated thoughtfully. The study of alien languages. How prescient of your species. The crystals showed her Marcus's first encounter with the sphere. He had spent weeks trying to decode the shifting symbols, slowly realizing that they weren't just decorative, they were some kind of interface. The patterns responded to thought, to intention, to the presence of a conscious mind. What happened when you activated it? Queen's RTHYSS asked. Marcus hesitated. The memories of that moment were fragmented, filtered through trauma and neurological damage. But he could feel the Queen's patience wearing thin, and the image of Mumbai's destruction haunted him. It connected to my mind, he wrote. Show me things. Other worlds. Other species. A galactic civilization that existed before humans evolved. The predecessors, the Queen breathed. You made contact with a predecessor archive. The floating crystals began to spin faster, their humming growing more intense. Marcus felt the Queen's excitement as she realized the implications of what he was telling her. These archives are incredibly rare, she explained. Most were destroyed or hidden when the predecessors vanished. The few that remain are heavily protected by psychic barriers that kill anyone who tries to access them. But somehow you survived. Marcus closed his eyes and let the memories flow. The moment of contact had been indescribable, like having his consciousness expanded to encompass the entire galaxy. He had seen worlds beyond counting, species that had risen and fallen while Earth was still a ball of molten rock. He had witnessed the birth and death of stars, the construction of artificial planets, the creation of technologies that bent the laws of physics like clay. And he had seen the Zephyrians. You were there, he wrote, looking up at the Queen. Your species. I saw them in the archive. Queen's RTHYSS went very still. The spinning crystals slowed to a gentle rotation. What did you see? She asked quietly. Marcus picked up his pen and began to write rapidly. The Zephyrian Empire was one of many species that served the predecessors. You were their enforcers, their psychic police force. But you rebelled. You used your abilities to overthrow your creators. The Queen's silver skin darkened slightly, the equivalent of a human blush, Marcus realized. The archive showed you the war of liberation. It wasn't liberation. Marcus continued writing. It was theft. The predecessors tried to ascend to a higher dimension, to become beings of pure thought. You prevented them. You trapped their consciousness in psychic prisons and stole their technology. The Queen's composure cracked. With a gesture, she sent the floating crystals flying away from Marcus, their psychic resonance cutting off abruptly. The sudden silence was deafening. You understand nothing, she snarled. Her musical voice turned harsh and discordant. The predecessors were tyrants who treated entire species as laboratory animals. They created us to be their servants, their tools, their disposable soldiers. We fought for our freedom. Freedom to do the same thing to other species. Marcus wrote. Queen's RTHYSS raised her hand as if to strike him, then stopped. Her ancient eyes blazed with fury and something else, pain, perhaps, or regret. We did what was necessary to survive, she said. The predecessors left behind weapons capable of destroying entire star systems. If we had not claimed them, other species would have. We brought order to chaos, stability to anarchy. Marcus looked at her steadily and wrote, "You became what you fought against." The queen stared at his words for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, more controlled. "Perhaps, but it changes nothing. The galaxy is what it is, and strength is the only law that matters." She gestured, and the memory resonance chamber began to reconfigure itself. New crystals appeared, these ones darker and more menacing than the others. "I have been patient with you," the queen said. "I have tried to extract information gently, with minimal trauma to your mind. But you are proving resistant to cooperation." The new crystals began to pulse with a red light that made Marcus's head throb. He could feel them probing deeper, pushing past his surface thoughts toward the core of his consciousness. The predecessor archive you accessed contained more than just historical records, Queen's HFY said. It contained technical specifications, weapon designs, perhaps even the location of other archives. "I need that information." "I don't remember," Marcus wrote quickly. "The contact damaged my mind. Most of the information was lost." "We shall see about that." The red crystals flared brighter, and Marcus screamed silently as they drove into his mind like spears of crystallized pain. The queen was no longer being gentle or careful. She was tearing through his memories with brute force, searching for anything related to predecessor technology. But as she dug deeper, she encountered something unexpected. The neurological damage that protected Marcus from psychic control wasn't random. It was structured, purposeful. The predecessor archive hadn't just shown him information. It had modified his brain, creating new neural pathways and blocking others. "Extraordinary," the queen murmured, pausing her assault. "The archive didn't just give you knowledge, it gave you tools. Defenses. It turned your mind into a fortress." Marcus wiped blood from his nose and wrote, "It knew you would come. The predecessors prepared for this." Queen's RTHYSS stepped back, her expression troubled. "The archives are supposed to be dormant. They have been inactive for millions of years. Unless they detected a threat," Marcus continued writing, "something that would require their return." The queen's eyes widened as the implications sank in. "You're suggesting that the predecessors are still alive? That they're monitoring the galaxy?" Marcus shrugged and wrote, "You tell me. You're the one who's been conquering worlds for centuries. Haven't you noticed any patterns? Any signs of ancient technology awakening?" For the first time since their encounter began, Queen ZaraTHYSS looked uncertain. She began to pace the chamber, her movements less fluid than before. "There have been anomalies," she admitted. "Worlds where our conquest was inexplicably delayed. Technology failures that shouldn't have been possible. Reports of strange signals from deep space. The predecessors are coming back," Marcus wrote, "and they're not happy about what you've done with their galaxy." The queen spun to face him. "Prove it. Show me what the archive taught you." Marcus hesitated. The memories of his contact with the predecessor archive were fragmentary and painful to access. But buried within them were things the queen needed to know, things that might prevent a war that could destroy every inhabited world in the galaxy. He closed his eyes and reached into the deepest parts of his mind, past the damage and the defenses to the place where alien knowledge had taken root. The process was agony, like trying to remember a dream while someone hammered nails into his skull. Images flashed through his consciousness. Star maps showing the locations of hidden predecessor bases, technical diagrams for weapons beyond imagination, and, most importantly, a countdown. A vast cosmic timer that had been triggered by the Zephyrians' psychic activities. "They're coming," he wrote, his hand shaking from the effort of accessing the buried memories. The predecessors detect large-scale psychic manipulation as a sign of unauthorized technology use. Your invasion of Earth triggered their automated defense protocols. Queen ZaraTHYSS read his words and went pale. "How long do we have?" Marcus forced himself deeper into the painful memories, searching for specific details. The archive showed me calculations, time frames. They travel between dimensions, so distance doesn't matter. Maybe weeks, maybe days. The Queen began issuing mental commands to her ship. Marcus could sense the psychic communications flowing out to the fleet surrounding Earth, carrying orders and warnings. "This changes everything," she muttered. "If the predecessors return, every psychic species in the galaxy is at risk. They won't distinguish between willing servants and rebellious children." "Maybe that was the point," Marcus wrote. "Maybe they always planned to come back and clean house." Queen's RTHYSS stopped pacing and stared at him with new respect. "You knew this would happen. The archive didn't just give you defenses, it gave you a mission." Marcus nodded slowly. The truth was more complex than he could easily explain in writing, but the Queen was beginning to understand. The predecessor archive hadn't been a random discovery. It had been placed where humans would find it, at exactly the right time to prepare them for what was coming. "Your species was chosen," the Queen said, wonder creeping in her voice. "The predecessors selected humans as their agents. They gave you the tools to resist psychic control because they knew you would need them. We're not the only ones," Marcus wrote. "The archive show me other species, other agents scattered across the galaxy, all of them preparing for the predecessor's return." The Queen sat down heavily in a chair that materialized from the crystalline floor. For a moment, she looked less like a galactic conqueror and more like a tired, frightened being who had just realized she was in far more trouble than she had ever imagined. "The irony is exquisite," she said bitterly. "I conquered your world to gain access to predecessor technology. But in doing so, I may have doomed my entire species." "Not necessarily," Marcus wrote. "The archives show me something else. A way to stop what's coming. But it requires cooperation." Queen's RTHYSS looked up sharply. "What kind of cooperation?" Marcus began writing rapidly, his hand cramping from the effort. "The predecessors aren't evil, just protective. They've been gone for millions of years, letting the galaxy develop on its own. But they programmed their archives to watch for certain trigger conditions. Large-scale psychic domination was one of them." "So your suggestion is that we simply stop conquering worlds?" the Queen asked sarcastically. "Your suggestion is that we prove to them that their technology is in responsible hands," Marcus corrected. "The archives can communicate with each other across dimensional barriers. If we can show them that psychic abilities are being used to protect rather than dominate, they might call off their automated defenses." The Queen was quiet for several minutes, processing this information. Finally, she spoke. "You're proposing an alliance between the Zephyrian Empire and the human species." Marcus nodded and wrote, "And every other species that wants to survive. The predecessors are coming whether we like it or not. We can fight them individually and lose, or work together and maybe convince them that we've grown beyond our primitive origins." Queen's RTHSS stood up and began pacing again, but this time her movements were thoughtful rather than agitated. "It would require a complete restructuring of galactic civilization, an end to conquest, the establishment of cooperative alliances, the sharing of technology and resources. It would require you to give up being an empress," Marcus wrote bluntly. The Queen laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Yes, it would. The question is whether I value my empire more than the continued existence of my species." She turned to face him directly. "And what role would you play in this grand alliance? You can't even speak." Marcus smiled for the first time since arriving on the ship. He pulled out his notebook and wrote, "I may not be able to speak, but I can listen. The archive taught me how to access the predecessor communication network. I can serve as a translator, a bridge between the returning predecessors and the younger species of the galaxy." "A silent diplomat," the Queen mused. "How fitting." She gestured, and the crystalline walls of the chamber became transparent again. Earth hung in space before them, blue and beautiful, and still very much under threat from the Zephyrian fleet. We will need to move quickly, Queen HFY said. If what you've shown me is accurate, we have very little time to establish this alliance before the predecessors arrive. There's something else, Marcus wrote. The other human agents, the ones the archive prepared. We'll need to find them. They have pieces of the puzzle that I don't. The Queen nodded. I will recall my invasion fleet and begin reaching out to other psychic species. But understand this, Marcus Chun. If you are wrong about any of this, if the predecessors cannot be reasoned with, or if this alliance fails to satisfy them, I will not hesitate to resume my conquest of your world. Marcus wrote his response carefully. And if you betray this alliance or attempt to use the situation to expand your power, the archive taught me how to activate predecessor defensive systems. I may not be able to stop you with words, but I can call down forces that will make your empire look like a collection of sandcastles. Queen HFY stared at him for a long moment, then smiled, the first genuine expression of amusement he had seen from her. I believe you actually could, she said. Very well, silent diplomat. Let us see if we can prevent the end of the galaxy as we know it. The Queen began issuing orders to her fleet, calling for an immediate ceasefire and the establishment of communication channels with Earth's governments. Marcus watched through the transparent walls as the crystalline ships began to pull back from their threatening positions around the planet. It was a start. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen. The first interspecies diplomatic meeting in human history took place in what used to be the United Nations building in New York. Queen HFY had restored Mumbai as a gesture of good faith, somehow reversing the complete molecular dissolution her weapons had caused, but the scars of that demonstration remained in everyone's memory. Marcus sat at a circular table that had been hastily constructed to accommodate beings of vastly different sizes and physiologies. To his left was President Chun Li of the United Earth Coalition, a woman who had been thrust into leadership when most world governments had collapsed during the invasion's first hours. To his right was Queen HFY, her crystalline form somehow managing to look both regal and slightly uncomfortable in the human design chair. Around the table sat representatives from 12 different species, all of whom had received the Queen's emergency transmission about the returning predecessors. Some Marcus recognized from the archive's historical records. The HFY with their chitinous exoskeletons and compound eyes, the Veltar who existed as colonies of sentient gas, the massive Gorak whose rocky bodies made the building's floor creak ominously. Each species had its own translation system, but Marcus had volunteered to serve as the primary interpreter. The predecessor archive had given him an instinctive understanding of the base mathematical concepts that underlay all galactic languages. The question before us is simple, Queen HFY was saying, her words flowing through the translation matrix to emerge in each delegate's native tongue. Do we stand together against the predecessor's return, or do we face them separately and perish? Ambassador KLXDH of the HFY shifted nervously, his chitinous plates grinding against each other. Your Majesty speaks of cooperation, but just days ago you were threatening to enslave our worlds. Why should we trust that this is not another deception? Marcus wrote quickly on his tablet, which was connected to the translation system, because deception requires a future to be effective. If the predecessors return as expected, none of our civilizations will survive long enough for betrayal to matter. The Veltar delegate pulsed a deep purple color, indicating thoughtful consideration. The Silent One raises a valid point. Our sensor networks have detected spatial anomalies consistent with transdimensional travel. Something is indeed coming. Show them, Marcus wrote to the Queen. HFY nodded and activated a holographic display in the center of the table. The image showed a three-dimensional map of the galaxy, with various locations marked in different colors. These are the positions of known predecessor archives, she explained. Until recently, all of them were dormant. But in the past 72 hours, every single one has begun transmitting signals into dimensional space. The delegates leaned forward, studying the display. The Goric representative, whose voice sounded like grinding stone when translated, rumbled, "What kind of signals?" Marcus accessed his damaged memories again, wincing at the familiar pain. "Activation codes," he wrote. "They're waking up dormant systems across the galaxy. Weapon platforms, surveillance networks, automated defense stations. Everything the predecessors built is coming online." "To what end?" asked President Chun-Li. "Assessment and judgment." Marcus continued writing. "The archives are designed to evaluate whether the galaxy's current inhabitants are worthy of inheriting predecessor technology. If we fail their test—" He didn't finish the sentence. The implications were clear enough. Ambassador Galactic's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of extreme agitation. "What are the criteria for this assessment? How do we ensure we pass their judgment?" Marcus looked around the table at the assembled delegates. Each species had its own unique evolutionary path, its own cultural values, its own definition of civilization. Finding common ground among them would be difficult enough. Convincing ancient beings of godlike power that they deserve to exist would be nearly impossible. "The archive showed me fragments," he wrote carefully. "The predecessors valued three things above all others: wisdom, cooperation, and growth. Species that could demonstrate these qualities were allowed to flourish. Those that couldn't were exterminated." Queen Zarthyss finished grimly. The historical records are quite clear on this point. The Veltar delegate's color shifted to worried yellow. "How much time do we have to demonstrate these qualities?" Marcus consulted the countdown that ticked constantly in the back of his mind, a gift from his contact with the archive. 6 days, 14 hours, 37 minutes. That's when the first predecessor scout ships will emerge from dimensional space. Silence fell over the assembly. 6 days to reshape galactic civilization. It seemed impossible. "There is one factor working in our favor," Marcus wrote after a moment. "The predecessors don't expect perfect transformation. They understand that lasting change takes time. What they're looking for is evidence of intent, of genuine effort to evolve beyond conquest and domination." Specifically, President Chun-Li asked. Marcus pulled up the fragmentary memories again, sorting through the pain to find relevant details. Voluntary cooperation between species, sharing of resources and technology, protection of weaker civilizations rather than exploitation, and, most importantly, evidence that psychic abilities are being used for creation rather than destruction. Queen Zarthyss laughed bitterly. "You're describing the opposite of everything my empire has done for the past 1,000 years. Then, maybe it's time for a new kind of empire," Marcus wrote. The Queen stared at him for a long moment. "What are you suggesting?" Marcus looked around the table again, then began writing rapidly. "Dissolve the Zephyrian Empire. Restructure it as the Galactic Cooperative. Instead of conquest, focus on defense. Instead of tribute, establish voluntary resource sharing agreements. Use your psychic abilities to facilitate communication and understanding between species." The other delegates began talking among themselves, their voices creating a cacophony of different languages and communication methods. Marcus could see the translation systems struggling to keep up with the rapid exchange of ideas. Ambassador Galactic was the first to address the table directly. The Kethvar Collective would consider joining such a cooperative, provided our territorial sovereignty is respected. The Veltar have always preferred cooperation to conflict, the purple delegate added. "We would contribute our biotechnology to the common good." The massive Goric representative took longer to respond, but when he did, his words carried the weight of bedrock. "The Stone Clan will offer protection to smaller species. It is time we prove that size and strength can serve wisdom rather than greed." One by one, the other delegates added their voices to the discussion. Marcus watched with growing amazement as centuries of mutual distrust and competition began to dissolve into tentative hope. But not everyone was convinced. "This is madness," declared Ambassador Carr of the Nexus Alliance, a confederation of technologically advanced species. You ask us to abandon proven systems of governance based on the word of a damaged human and the fear of ancient legends. The legends are real, Marcus wrote firmly, and the proof is coming whether you believe it or not. Tkar's reptilian features twisted in disdain. Even if these predecessors do return, what makes you think cooperation will satisfy them? Perhaps they prefer strong, hierarchical civilizations to chaotic cooperatives. Queen's RTHYSS leaned forward. Because I've seen what happens to strong, hierarchical civilizations when they displease the predecessors. My own species barely survived their first encounter with ancient technology. We learned to be conquerors because it was the only way to stay ahead of forces we couldn't understand. And now, Tkar challenged. Now we have a chance to understand them, the Queen replied. The human has provided us with something my empire never possessed. Genuine communication with predecessor archives. For the first time in millions of years, we can speak with our creators instead of simply fearing them. Marcus felt a familiar pressure building in his skull, the sensation that had preceded every major revelation from the archive. He gripped his pen tightly and began writing as fast as his hand could move. They're listening, he wrote. The archives are monitoring this meeting. They're evaluating our responses in real time. The delegates fell silent, looking around nervously as if expecting ancient beings to materialize in the room. What are they looking for? President Shen li whispered. Marcus closed his eyes and let the archive's influence wash over him. The pain was intense, but beneath it he could sense vast alien intelligences observing their primitive attempts at diplomacy. He felt their curiosity, their cautious hope, and their deep skepticism about whether any of the younger species had truly learned from the mistakes of the past. Sincerity, he wrote when the pressure in his head subsided. They can sense deception across dimensional barriers. They know when beings are cooperating out of fear versus genuine desire for growth. Tkar shifted uncomfortably. And what if our cooperation is motivated by fear? What if we're only working together because the alternative is extinction? Then you start with fear and hope it grows into something better, Marcus wrote. The predecessors understand that motivation. They began the same way, millions of years ago. What do you mean? Queen's RTHYSS asked. Marcus accessed deeper levels of the archive, pushing past barriers that sent spikes of agony through his damaged neural pathways. The predecessors weren't always advanced. They started as a collection of primitive tribes on a single world. They learned cooperation because their planet was dying and they needed to work together to survive. The holographic display changed, showing images from the deepest layers of predecessor history. The delegates watched in fascination as the story unfolded. A species on the brink of extinction learning to share resources, developing technology, reaching for the stars not out of ambition, but out of necessity. They made mistakes. Marcus continued writing through waves of pain. Wars, conquests, the domination of other species. But they learned from those mistakes. They evolved beyond their primitive origins and became something greater. And they expect us to do the same, President Chunli said quietly. They hope we can, Marcus corrected. The archives contain records of hundreds of species that failed this test, but they also contain records of dozens that succeeded. The predecessors want to see new forms of life flourish, but only if those forms can prove they won't repeat the errors of the past. Ambassador Tkar was quiet for a long moment, then spoke carefully. If we agree to this cooperative, hypothetically, what would be required of each member species? Queen's RTHYSS activated a new holographic display, this one showing a complex organizational chart, complete transparency in government and resource allocation, mandatory aid to developing civilizations, joint defense against external threats, and, most importantly, the gradual integration of psychic communication networks to facilitate genuine understanding between species. You're talking about the end of individual sovereignty, Tkar protested. I'm talking about the evolution of sovereignty, the Queen replied. moving from the rights of species to the responsibilities of sapient beings. Marcus felt another wave of pressure from the archives and began writing quickly. Time is running out. The scout ships have begun their approach. We need a decision now. The delegates looked at each other, centuries of distrust warring with the immediate need for survival. Marcus could see the calculations running through their minds. The risks of cooperation versus the certainty of destruction if they remained divided. It was the Goric representative who spoke first, his stone-deep voice carrying absolute conviction. The Stone Clan agrees to join the Galactic Cooperative. We swear by our bedrock to honor the principles of wisdom, cooperation, and growth. The Veltar Collective agrees. The Purple Delegate added quickly. We offer our biotechnology and our knowledge of harmonic cooperation. One by one, the other delegates added their voices to the growing alliance. Even Ambassador Tar, after a long internal struggle, finally nodded his agreement. The Nexus Alliance will participate, he said reluctantly, though we reserve the right to withdraw if this experiment proves disastrous. Noted and accepted, Queen Zura THYSS replied. Then, she turned to President Chun-Li. And Earth? Will humanity join the cooperative as full members? President Chun-Li looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. Earth agrees to join, she said. We offer our archaeological knowledge, our linguistic abilities, and our connections to the predecessor archives. Queen Zura THYSS stood up, her crystalline form catching the light from the holographic displays. Then, let it be recorded that on this day, 13 species chose cooperation over conquest, growth over stagnation, hope over fear. We dissolve the old empires and declare the formation of the Galactic Cooperative. She raised her hand, and Marcus felt psychic energy flowing out from her to touch the minds of every delegate present. It wasn't domination or control. It was an invitation, a gentle connection that allowed each being to sense the genuine emotions and intentions of the others. For the first time in galactic history, 13 different species shared a moment of perfect understanding. And somewhere in the depths of space, the predecessor scout ships altered their approach vectors, their weapons powering down from full combat readiness to cautious observation mode. It was a start. The predecessor ship emerged from dimensional space like a flower blooming in reverse, reality folding inward until something impossible took shape against the backdrop of stars. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, a crystalline structure the size of Earth's moon, but seemingly weightless, its surfaces reflecting not light, but pure thought made visible. Marcus stood on the observation deck of the Cooperative's hastily assembled flagship, watching the ancient vessel approach. Around him, representatives from all 13 member species waited in tense silence. The past 6 days had been a whirlwind of activity, dismantling imperial structures, establishing cooperative protocols, and preparing for this moment. First contact with beings who had shaped the galaxy before human ancestors had crawled from the primordial seas. Incoming transmission, announced the ship's AI, its voice synthesized from the combined linguistic patterns of all member species. Source, predecessor vessel. Nature, multidimensional psychic broadcast. Marcus felt the familiar pressure building in his skull as the archive implanted in his mind activated. He gripped his tablet, ready to serve as translator between the ancient beings and the young civilizations that awaited judgment. The voice that filled their minds was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It simply was eternal, patient, and impossibly vast. Children of the stars, it spoke, and Marcus hurriedly translated the concepts that human language couldn't adequately express. We have returned to evaluate the progress of those who inherited our tools. We are pleased to observe cooperation where once there was only conquest. Queen Zura THYSS stepped forward, her crystalline form somehow managing to look humble despite her imposing presence. We greet you, predecessors. We have tried to learn from the wisdom you left behind. You have done well, young queen, the voice replied, and Marcus could sense ancient approval flowing through the words. The dissolution of your empire was noted and appreciated. But words and intentions are simple things. We must see how you respond to challenges. The predecessor ship moved closer, and Marcus felt reality shifting around them. The observation deck suddenly expanded beyond its original dimensions, space bending to accommodate a presence too large for normal physics to contain. And then they appeared. The predecessors weren't physical beings in any sense that human minds could easily process. They existed as patterns of conscious energy, their thoughts taking form as geometric shapes that danced through higher dimensions. Marcus's archive-modified brain could perceive them directly, but he watched the other delegates struggling to make sense of what they were seeing. "Do not strain your perception," the lead predecessor spoke gently. "We will assume forms more comfortable for your minds to process." The energy patterns shifted, taking on shapes that were almost familiar, tall, graceful beings that seemed to be carved from living starlight. They moved with fluid precision, their every gesture carrying the weight of eons. "I'm the one you might call the evaluator," their leader said. "These are my companions, the historian, the architect, and the gardener. We four have been tasked with determining whether this galaxy's current inhabitants are ready for the next phase of evolution." President Chun-Li cleared her throat nervously. "What exactly does that mean?" The evaluator's attention focused on her, and Marcus felt the vast intelligence studying the human leader with casual intensity. "Your species stands at a crossroads," it explained. "You have developed sufficient technology to reshape worlds and influence the development of other life forms. You can choose to use these abilities responsibly, or you can repeat the mistakes that led to our own departure from this reality." "What mistakes?" asked Ambassador KLXDH, his chitinous plates clicking with nervous energy. The historian stepped forward, its form shifting to display images from a deep past. "We became too powerful, too removed from the struggles of ordinary existence. We began to see ourselves as gardeners of the galaxy, entitled to decide which species would flourish and which would perish. Our good intentions corrupted us until we were no different from tyrants." Marcus felt a chill of recognition. The archive had shown him glimpses of this history, but seeing it explained by the predecessors themselves was different. He began writing rapidly on his tablet. "You left because you realized you were becoming what you had originally fought against." He translated his thoughts into words the others could understand. "Precisely," the evaluator confirmed. "We retreated to higher dimensions and left automated systems to monitor the galaxy's development. We hoped that new forms of consciousness would evolve, beings who could wield power without being corrupted by it." The architect spoke for the first time, its voice carrying harmonics that made the ship's hull resonate. "You have demonstrated the capacity for cooperation in crisis. But cooperation born of fear is fragile. We must see whether your alliance can survive prosperity." "What kind of test?" Queen Zara THYSS asked. The gardener gestured, and the space around them filled with holographic displays showing various worlds throughout the galaxy. Some were thriving, others were in crisis, and a few were on the verge of complete ecological collapse. "We will provide you with the tools to solve these problems," the gardener explained. "Terraforming technology that can restore dead worlds in a matter of years. Biotechnology that can cure any disease. Energy sources that could power entire civilizations for millennia." The delegates exchanged glances. The offer was everything they could have hoped for, but Marcus could sense the trap hidden within it. "The test is whether we can distribute these gifts fairly," he wrote, then spoke aloud through the translation system. "Whether we use them to help everyone or just ourselves." "The silent one understands," the evaluator said with what might have been approval. "Power reveals character more clearly than adversity. We have seen countless civilizations destroy themselves with gifts that were meant to elevate them." President Chun-Li stepped forward. "What happens if we fail your test?" The historian's form darkened slightly. "The automated systems will activate. Every trace of advanced technology in the galaxy will be removed. Your civilizations will be reduced to pre-industrial levels and monitored until you develop sufficient wisdom to try again. And if we succeed, asked the Veltar delegate, then you will inherit what we built, the architect replied. The dimensional gateways, the stellar engineering technology, the accumulated knowledge of 1,000,000 years of exploration. You will become the new gardeners of this galaxy. Marcus felt the archive stirring in his mind, showing him visions of what that inheritance could mean. Cities that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Worlds reshaped according to the inhabitants' needs. Life forms beyond imagination, flourishing under the protection of benevolent advanced civilizations. But he also saw the dangers. The temptation to play God. The gradual drift towards seeing lesser species as pets or obstacles. The same path that had led the predecessors to exile themselves from their own creation. How do we avoid making your mistakes? He wrote. The evaluator studied him with what seemed like genuine curiosity. Your mind bears our modifications more clearly than any we have encountered in eons. Through you, we can share not just our knowledge, but our understanding of its proper use. Marcus felt something shifting in his damaged neural pathways. The pain that had been his constant companion since the Nevada facility suddenly began to ease. The barriers that protected him from psychic manipulation remained, but new connections were forming, pathways that would allow him to access predecessor knowledge without the agony he had endured. Your silence has served you well, the evaluator continued. But the time for silence is ending. You will need your voice for what comes next. Marcus opened his mouth experimentally and felt his vocal cords responding for the first time in months. When he spoke, his voice was rough and uncertain, but it was his own. What comes next? He asked aloud, the words feeling strange after so long without speech. The real test begins now, the gardener replied. We will provide you with the promised technologies and then withdraw to observe. You will have one standard galactic year to prove that you can use these gifts wisely. The predecessor ship began to transform, its crystalline structure reconfiguring itself into something resembling a vast library or archive. Information flowed out from it in streams of pure data, uploading into the computers and minds of the assembled delegates. Marcus felt the knowledge washing over him. Techniques for reshaping matter at the atomic level, methods for communicating across interstellar distances instantaneously, principles for extending sapient life indefinitely. It was overwhelming and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Remember, the historian warned as the transfer continued, knowledge without wisdom is destruction. Power without humility is tyranny. Use what we give you to elevate all life, not just your own. The other delegates were struggling to process the influx of information. Marcus could see some of them already calculating how their species could benefit from the new technologies, while others seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of what they were being offered. Queen Zaratich YSS was the first to speak. This will change everything. The balance of power between species, the nature of galactic civilization itself. That is the point, the architect replied. Evolution requires change. The question is whether you will guide that change or be consumed by it. Marcus looked around the observation deck at the 13 species that would now determine the galaxy's future. They were so different from each other, different biologies, different cultures, different ways of understanding reality. But they had chosen to work together despite those differences. That had to count for something. We'll need oversight, he said, his voice growing stronger with use. Some way to monitor ourselves and prevent the corruption you warned about. The archives will serve that function, the evaluator explained. They will record your actions and evaluate your progress. But the ultimate responsibility lies with you. You must be your own judges. The knowledge transfer was complete. The predecessor ship began to fade, retreating back toward the dimensional barriers from which it had emerged. 1 year, the evaluator said as its form grew translucent. Use it wisely. And then they were gone, leaving the 13 species alone with more power than any of them had ever imagined possessing. The silence that followed was profound. Each delegate seemed lost in contemplation of what had just occurred and what it meant for their civilizations. Marcus was the first to break the silence. "We need protocols," he said. "Rules for how the new technologies will be distributed and used. Safeguard against any one species gaining too much advantage over the others." "Agreed," Queen Zura THYSS said. "But more than that, we need to remember why we formed this alliance in the first place. Not because we wanted power, but because we wanted to survive. Now we need to prove we deserve to thrive." Ambassador Tar, who had been skeptical of the alliance from the beginning, nodded slowly. "The Nexus Alliance commits to sharing all technological advances with the cooperative. We will not use our new knowledge for competitive advantage." One by one, the other delegates made similar commitments. Marcus felt a cautious optimism growing in his chest. They were off to a good start, but he knew the real test would come when they returned to their home worlds and had to convince billions of beings to embrace cooperation over competition. "There's something else," he said. "The predecessors mentioned other species throughout the galaxy, ones that aren't part of our alliance yet. We'll need to reach out to them, share what we've learned, help them develop their own cooperative agreements. A galactic civilization based on voluntary cooperation," President Chun-Li mused. "It sounds almost too good to be true." "That's why we had a year to prove it's not," Marcus replied. "The predecessors aren't going to judge us just on our intentions. They're going to watch how we actually use what they've given us." Queen Zura THYSS activated the ship's communication systems, preparing to send messages to all cooperative member worlds. "Then let's begin," she said. "We have a galaxy to transform." Marcus looked out at the stars, thinking about the long road ahead. The silence that had protected him was broken, but perhaps that was fitting. The time for hiding, for passive resistance, was over. Now came the harder task, proving that the galaxy's younger species could wield the tools of gods without becoming monsters themselves. He touched the archive in his mind, feeling the vast store of predecessor knowledge waiting to be accessed. With it came responsibility, not just to humanity, but to every form of life that would be affected by their choices. The real test had indeed begun, and for the first time since losing his voice in that Nevada facility, Marcus felt ready to meet whatever challenges lay ahead. The stars awaited their decision.